All right, so we're back in the Beit Midrash, learning Masechet Makkot, and we're holding on page 10b of the Masechta, and we've been in the discussion of God's role in helping those who want to help themselves and helping those who are sometimes into committing some evil or idolatrous deeds. And we had a little bit of a foray into the landscape of Tanakh, that is Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. We tried to bring proofs from all over that God either really does play on the chessboard with us and move the pieces around, or we said, does God just wind it up and let it go? And we talked about big theological issues concerning God's role in the nature of, and I would say, you could say history. But here's the bigger piece that we didn't, I think, hit the symbol hard enough on last time we talked about this. And that is, what's God's role in crime? What is it about crime uniquely within this manifestation, this reality of human consciousness, of this phase of human relationships, human relations, that crime still happens and that we have to try to sort out what really is the nature of this ability we have to kill ourselves and kill each other. Part of what the philosophical workout of Torah is all about when it comes to killing and murder, as we have seen in Makkot, is the question about mens rea. What's the state of mind? The Torah knows it. Was he his enemy 3 days ago? Did he have enmity in his heart towards this person? What is premeditated? What is not premeditated? What is unintentional but still dangerous? What's completely, to use a different word that we saw in the translations of the Torah verses, both in Numbers and Deuteronomy, what is unwittingly? And is there a difference between unwittingly and unintentional? And so all of this comes into focus as we continue to learn in the Gemara. And it stays in focus, and it's going to be particular. It's going to be a particular focus of our section tonight to say, what are we really coming to address? What does the Torah really believe about all we face by way of this culture of blood vengeance, the idea that a killer has shed blood, and whether or not that killer, by shedding blood, inherently is guilty and deserving of a death penalty, or whether or not, as the Torah is explaining, the intention is an important element within the committing of the crime, which we would still say is a crime. And are there other penalties or there are other responses to this ability to kill, happened to kill, unwittingly killed, unintentionally killed, and how deeply are we committed to those other responses and why? Okay, so I'm going to share the screen so we can jump back into text. And let me just scroll to where we're going to start tonight. We're on 10a towards the end. So if you have your Schattenstein edition you're following in, we're going to just remind ourselves that at the 10a, the end of it, the Mishnah taught the very end of 10a. Roads were aligned for them from this city to that city. And we had a baraita there that the signs said refuge this way. Okay? This was a parsing out, and I want to continue as we go through to really focus in on what part of the Torah we're explicating, because that's going to become important for a conversation and for a look at the scholarly work that I'm going to bring later. That's a part of Deuteronomy. So let's just remember that the road system that we talked about before is a piece of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy concerns itself with having really good roads and road signage. So we have road signage that gets people to it. And then we had this introduction on 10b of God's place and is there ultimate justice, and God wants you to go your direction, and does God really help you go your direction, and how does that manifest within the thinking about crime, and could God really be behind these crimes? And now we're going to get into some of the halachot again about what's going on when the case of an unintentional murder happens, in Deuteronomy's way of expressing it. And we have a verse where we have a pronoun that is a little unclear as to who is the him that the verse is referring to. And we're going to have a bunch of braitas. We're going to have a Tannaitic argument, very early strata of the Talmudic material, right? The braitas being the outside the Mishnah material. And the braitas referred to include sometimes Mishnah material, because you can refer to Mishnaic material as Tannaitic material, as braitas themselves. So if I have lots of braitas that are being thrust around, and I have Mishnah that's being thrown around to kind of do the boxing match about what some word modifies, what the pronoun him is going to mean, I see that I have a very early level machloket. I have a very early discussion in this layer of the Gemara we're about to launch into about the meaning of him. So if you're in the Steinsaltz, we're on the bottom of page 67 at the new section about the Gemara resuming the discussion of the halachot of exile. If you're following in the Schottenstein edition, I only have the electronic version of that these days. So find Amar Rav Huna. So if you have Schottenstein, 10b, a little bit into the page, not so far, it's probably on 10b1. And it's Amar Rav Huna, Rotzeach Shegala Le'ir Miklat. Here comes the share. Okay. Everybody, you see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up. Make sure I've got my electronics right. Okay, good. See, maybe I'm going to even be able to increase the size a little bit. Okay. So nice when I have two screens and I can play with my text and I don't have just one setting, because I can't, when I use my laptop alone, play with the text behind all your faces. Okay, so here we go. What we have here is a resumption of this discussion about what happens on the way when they're going to the cities of exile. What we know from before is going to get repeated, but it's going to be in this context now of this machloket, this disagreement. And the disagreement is about a pronoun, and we'll see what the discussion now is. Amar Rav Huna, Rotzeach Shegala Le'ir Miklat, Umitzao Goel Adam V'Harago Patur. The Gemara says, Rav Huna taught, in the case of an unintentional murderer who was exiled to the city of refuge, so he's on the way to the city of refuge, and the blood redeemer found him on the way and killed him. He is exempt. So he's exempt from what? If the blood redeemer finds him and he kills him on the way, he's exempt from the death penalty, right? If we're talking about the blood avenger, and he's outside the city of refuge, and he finds the unintentional murder outside, then he is exempt. The Gemara notes that Rav Huna holds like this: V'lo ein mishpat mavet. So here's the lo, and for him, there's no death penalty. Now, you could probably tell what the argument's going to be about, because who are we talking about when I say for him there's no death penalty? Since you've been learning Makkot, if I say to you, and for him there's no death penalty, you might have even said, we're not talking about the blood avenger. Who are we talking about? The unintentional murderer. We know that he's sent to the city of refuge, he's sent to the Ir Miklat, because it was unintentional. That's what we've been saying, that this city is set up for him, and we've been talking about how to set up the whole city. But now we're back to a discussion that seems to blur the lines a little bit. Vis-a-vis this lo, ein mishpat mavet. Rav Huna holds, B'goel hadam hu dichtiv. When it comes to explaining who has no sentence of death, then we're talking about the Goel Hadam, which we could figure out from the straightforward sense of the Torah, it seems, in some places. But since we were talking about the whole system, it might have just worked that V'lo ein mishpat mavet, meaning the unintentional murderer has no death sentence coming to him. That would have been the reason why a Goel Hadam, a blood avenger, couldn't take the killer's blood. But Rav Huna and the Gemara is now bringing back a position that says, even though we were working on getting rid of the blood vengeance system within society, and we talked a lot about this, now Rav Huna is saying, well, if the guy finds him on the way outside the city, he has no death sentence. We're talking about the blood avenger. Now, the Gemara doesn't want to hold that for him there's no death sentence relates to the blood avenger. The Gemara is going to challenge it in a classic way with Breita material, as we said, same strata. So there's really no argument about whether or not we could say historically it came later, the material. We have very much a discussion that goes on right in the Tanaitic layer of the Gemara, Meiteve. Gemara raises an objection to the opinion of Rav Huna from this Breita, V'lo ein mishpat mavet. For him, there's no death sentence. Berotseach hakatuv medaber. We're talking about the actual guy who was the killer. In this case, the one identified as the unintentional killer. Ata omer berotseach? Are you really trying to hold that it's talking about the rotseach? Oh, eino ela b'goel hadam. Shouldn't we understand that the death sentence is not applicable to the blood avenger? Shehu omer v'hu lo sone lo mitmol shilshom heve omer berotseach hakatuv medaber. The Breita kinds of says here, let me add proof to the pudding by telling you that I understood when Deuteronomy said, and he did not hate him from before, that you could tell we're not talking about the blood avenger. We identified the subject of our paragraph when we described the mens rea, the mindset, the intentionality or lack thereof of the rotseach. Remember, we were using this term rotseach now interchangeably, as we've said. This term, the murderer or the killer, it's not a judgment call that he is a murderer who deserves the death penalty. We had identified him as the one who had no enmity 3 days ago. And therefore, what? We don't adjudicate the matter as if he was an enemy and plotted against his friend. We see him in court as a guy who definitely unintentionally murdered. And since the vocabulary of the passage in question in Deuteronomy speaks to this guy who was the unintentional murderer when it described his state of mind, that's the one who is being described by this part of the verse, Velo ein mishpat mavet. For him, the unintentional murderer, there is no death penalty because it was not intentional. Gemara is going to keep the discussion alive. Ping pong. Get ready. Who de amar ki haitana de tanya velo ein mishpat mavet. Let's go back to this exploration of who we're really talking about when it says for him there's no death penalty. Begoel hadam hakatuv midaber. No, it's definitely talking about the blood avenger. Ata omer begoel adam hakatuv midaber o eino ela barotzeach. Wait a minute, maybe it is talking about the one who did the killing. When it did talk about the person's state of mind and that he had no enmity, that really was talking about the guy who did the killing. Can't I just separate the two different parts of the verse and the paragraph and say it was the first one that was talking about the Rotseach, the guy who did the killing? That he had no enmity, he had no plan, he had no intention, he didn't want to really do the murder. He unintentionally killed, but then at the end of the verse, couldn't it be talking about Goel Adam? Couldn't it be talking about the blood avenger? He has no death penalty if he finds him along the way and kills him. Tanan. Gemara cites another Braita. Mosrin lo shnei talmidei chachamim. Remember that we sent 2 sheriffs with him, bailiffs, from the sheriff's department of the sages? No, the Gemara says, wait a minute, we sent 2 sheriffs with him. Shema yaharagenu baderech. We know that he's not supposed to kill him on the way. Our current understanding of the law, at least, is that we have laws against such blood vengeance. Vayidabru elav, and they are to teach him, my love, de matrube de ikatil barkot halohu. If they didn't teach him, wouldn't he be liable to be executed if he followed through on the blood vengeance, on the killing? So you can't say that lo ein mishpat mavet is the blood avenger. He doesn't have a death penalty if the sages were sent out to actually convince this guy not to do it based on our new laws and based on the fact that we have a system for educating everybody about the law. In other words, we have enough of a police force out here who's an educating group who's going to stop this guy. So we don't say for him there's no death penalty. The Gemara rejects the proof. No, that's not the case. Ki Tanya, we stick with a Braita, that Metanaitic material that actually keeps us on that same level, that early strata. We have a big machloket here within the same strata of the material. Vayadabru elav devarim ha're'uyim lo. When it says they'll speak to him about matters appropriate, Imrim lo, they say to him, Al tinhag bo minhag shofchei damim. Vishgaga ba ma'aseh liado. Don't accord him treatment appropriate for murderers, as it was unintentionally that he came to be involved in the incident. It was bishgaga. They explain, yes, that it was bishgaga, but in a certain sense, whether it's bishgaga or b'mezi, whether it's intentional or it's unintentional, there's a way to read it as if killing happened. And don't we say, a life for a life, a tooth for a tooth? There's a certain read within the strata of the earliest argumentation of the Talmud that wants very much to get us back to the very, very foundational question of, isn't killing killing? Rabbi Meir Omer, hu medaber al yadei atzmo, shneimar v'zeh devar harotzeach. Rabbi Meir even adds that when it comes to understanding the different people in focus, we have this notion that there is some speaking on behalf of himself to try to convince the guy, or maybe make the apology for what's been done, so that he can try to convince him that he shouldn't really take it out on him, that the blood vengeance is unnecessary. And he says, Amru, the Gemara says again, Amru lo, harbe shlichut osa. There are many things performed more effective through agency. And so sometimes you got to know just when to hold your tongue. Just a reminder of what we said before by way of the teachings and who's to do the speaking, and maybe what you want to stay clear of yourself in terms of negotiations. Amar Mar, the Gemara analyzes the Braita. Bishgaga ba ma'aseh li'ado. The Braita says it was unintentionally that he came to be involved in killing the guy. Pshita? Isn't this obvious? De'i b'mezid bar galut hu ein. Isn't it obvious that if he were intentionally a murderer, if he had killed first-degree homicide, why would he even be on the way? Don't we say otherwise, in essence, that the two chachamim who are sent, they don't need to explain that. Everybody knows that's the law. What do we need to say? We need to say specifically, lo ein mishpat mavet. They need to say very explicitly, there is no death penalty for this guy. It's off the books, squarely. In other words, you might have thought that there would have been a mishpat mavet, but since he's on the way to the city of exile, we say plainly he doesn't have a death penalty because, and I'll say it like this, Deuteronomy is interested in telling us that there is not a death penalty for a person who is unintentionally a killer. I'm purposely saying it's Deuteronomy that's being discussed because they're kind of maybe confounded is a good word instead of confused about the differences between what's going on in Numbers about the cities of refuge and what's going on in Deuteronomy itself. V'hatanya, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and so it's taught in a Braita that Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says, B'tchila echad shogeg ve'echad mezid makdimin la'arei miklat. But it gets a little bit confusing because we knew we had a system whereby everybody was sent to the cities of refuge as a holding pen before their trials. So that could have been the reason why somebody was confused. And we ultimately would have a case where he's actually vulnerable to the blood vengeance on the way. And we need to understand that according to the book of Numbers, he doesn't have a death penalty on his head now, this blood avenger. According to Numbers, he's able to shed that blood in response for the blood that was shed. And remember, that was a court system that was in use among the people, that they would send for the people when the trial time comes. Right is going to continue. Again, just pointing out, strata of the material, all Tanaitic, very early. And I'm bringing in the Deuteronomy versus Numbers kind of back and forth because I'm interested in how Braitas read the Torah specifically. I'm interested in how the Gemara, how the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and how the sages of the process over the years of creating a Gemara, I'm interested sometimes really to drill down to how the sages are looking at Torah. And I am bringing into focus tonight how they are looking at the two different places where the laws of the cities of refuge come into focus. because this argument is all about how to read the Torah that has two sets of laws that don't exactly look one like the other, even though they're very similar. And by arguing about a pronoun in one verse and going back and forth as to say whether or not it's the unintentional killer who has no death penalty, or it's the blood avenger who really incurs no death penalty, I have a philosophical difference between the book of Numbers, which allows for blood vengeance, and the book of Deuteronomy, which does not allow for it and is interested entirely in the intentionality of the killer, as is evidenced by what the Chachamim say to this blood avenger. They say, Bishgaga. They're pointing out that the law advanced in the sense that we really do adjudicate matters by the way that someone really was completely unintentional in their act, and not just unwittingly, but unintentionally was out there with a friend handling an axe. They had even maybe checked it beforehand, all those OSHA rules we talked about, and it really did happen. They are interested in advancing the law concerning the intentionality of the human being and individual. This is a radical move, actually, and that's why over here, you're going to get a little Talmudic now with bringing both Deuteronomy and Numbers into focus in the next paragraph. Misha nitchayev mita, haraguhu, shene'amar v'shalchu ziknei iro v'lakchu oto misham v'natnu oto biyad goel adam v'meit. It says that one who was found liable to receive the death penalty for intentional murder, after the trial, the court would execute him, as it is stated, and the elders of his city shall send and take him from there and deliver him into the hands of the blood redeemer, and he shall die. Now, that was when they used the blood redeemer as a methodology of punishment, even in Deuteronomy. And of course, we know that the court system's methodology of death penalty was expanded upon both in Sanhedrin, and we've made mention of them in Makkot, when it came to the different methods we had for administering death penalties. And with regard to one who was not found liable to receive the death penalty, though, because we adjudicate matters and we understand whether or not a person had intentionality or not, it was due to circumstances beyond his control. What did they do? V'hitzilu ha'eda et harotzeach miyad goel adam. They completely rescue the murderer from the hands of the blood redeemer. Mi shenitchayev galut machazirino tolim komo. They would, after they found him not liable, restore him to the place of refuge. Shene'emar v'heshivu oto ha'eda el ir miklato asher nas shama. They would restore him to his city of refuge that he fled there. They bring in Numbers to move us closer to the absolutist understanding of the responsibility of the community regarding unintentional murderers as is defined in Deuteronomy, with language from Numbers that also suggests that we must adjudicate matters to figure out whether or not this person was involved in an unintentional killing that would lead them to exile and being saved entirely from the Goel Hadam. They would save him. This is the important piece. V'hitzilu ha'eda miyad Goel Adam. Not even if the Goel Hadam found him on the road, could the Goel Hadam take his life now, based on where I land in this Tanaitic argumentation. I've now taken off the table the possibility, unless it's upended, and we'll see how it closes in a second, I've taken off the table the possibility that the Goel Hadam can actually kill the guy even on the way. Rabbi Omer, me'atzman hem golim. Rabbi Yehuda says, don't forget, people themselves knew where the cities of refuge were, and they could run there. K'svurin hen echad shogeg ve'echad mezid kol tot. People started to think about killing and murder as if both first-degree homicide and unintentional murder were forgivable because the rabbis created, based on Torah legislation, the possibility for an unintentional murder to live in a city of refuge and be saved entirely, even on the way, from a blood avenger. They thought, the rabbis really want to say that all killing can't be taken up by the blood avenger. But that wasn't exactly the case. They did want to legislate outright unintentional killers could go to the cities of refuge, but they did not succeed or really even desire to have first-degree murderers sent to cities of refuge and make them exempt from death penalties, because it said the community would hand them over to the blood avenger, and ultimately that is changed into a court system that does administer a death penalty, or at least says people are liable for it. And we've asked the question before whether or not any death penalty was ever really administered, and that's a different kind of discussion that we got into with a little bit of a reflection on that, where they were really worried that they would kill one innocent soul, and that probably was a statement of saying, I don't know if we could really have such a system even working for first-degree murderers. Rabbi Omer, they went there themselves. V'hen einan yoidin shebeshoigeg kol tot b'mezid einan kol tot. They didn't really make the distinction themselves until the courts helped sort it out. In other words, whether or not it was an unintentional murder or it was an intentional murder. And this just suggests that you needed a court system and at least judges, if not some type of advocates. And again, we don't know so much about the exact systems that were in place, but we need some type of sorting out of whether or not you have unintentional or intentional murder, homicide, or manslaughter. So, sharing more specifically this argumentation as it relates to Numbers in Deuteronomy, just to really drill home the point, Numbers 35, the unintentional manslayer, manslaughterer, says, defiles the land where the Lord abides by spilling blood on it. In order to prevent the divine presence from departing, which is the purpose of those laws, a manslaughterer must purge the land with his own blood. That was because he was a killer. However, when the act was unintentional, the law commands removing this unintentional manslayer. I use it because it's a little different than manslaughter. It's to say someone who killed someone. We want to exile him, and now we get the sense of why it's called a city of exile, because he needs to be exiled from the actual land itself. The cities themselves become, in a sense, alternative sacred ground, because they're not allowed to live on the land if they spill blood. So they exile him to a city of refuge, a city of exile. And what does it say in Numbers? And this gets into Bobby's question, until the death of the high priest. That law is not found specifically in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, one way of reading Torah is to simply find the two places in Torah that talk about the same subject and work out all the details Like if it said it in numbers over here, I could see that as being steps 1 and 2. Oh, this Deuteronomy step works for step 3, back to numbers step 4, Deuteronomy steps 5 and 6, etc. But another way of understanding Deuteronomy and numbers is that the Deuteronomic material acts a little like a machloket, another braita, Torah-idic material thrust over and against the numbers material. What's the same gives us a sense of, yeah, they're talking about the same issue. What's different is noticeable, and we have to understand why. In Deuteronomy, the unwilling killer is really untainted. He's innocent because it is entirely unintentional when it's really unintentional. He's not subject to a death penalty. He can't be killed on the way by a Goel Hadam, as in the Blood Avenger finds him on the way and kills him in Numbers. Therefore, anyone who kills him, including the Blood Avenger in Deuteronomy, is shedding innocent blood. God, in this sense, in the book of Deuteronomy, watches this whole thing unfold from heaven, back to our very introduction by Devorah Steinmetz's book on criminal law within Judaism. God is watching and says, yes, Deuteronomy, you've built on this numbers legislation. Now you're getting the point. It really does matter what a human being's intentionality really is when it comes to the shedding of another human being's blood. And if it's truly found in your court of law that it was unintentional and meets all the standards that you've created, then you have the ability to say to the Goel Adam, Ein lo mishpat mavet. He does not require, or there has been no decree of a death penalty on this person, even though he spilled blood. If the killing was inadvertent, God gives us the power within our court system and within our adjudication and in the Deuteronomic development on the numbers text to come up with a way to say that the killer is innocent, despite the fact that we would say in our court system, he's guilty. Innocent of what? Of the bloodshed that exiles us from the land. The unwitting killer goes to the city of refuge, yes, to protect himself from the blood avenger. As we read, they don't sell weapons there. Someone might try to sneak in. There are still angry people. But once the Chachamim have convinced him, and once the Chachamim, the sages, have explained this is no longer someone with a death penalty on his head, and we can resolve that issue, then, drum roll please, he might even be able to go free. He might only have to be there for as long as is necessary for the system to play out and work out. It's the Kohen HaGadol's blood or life that is given instead of the blood or life of the killer in the book of Numbers. The reason why someone's freed is because the Kohen Gadol's life is given instead of the actual killer. We're going to get to some reasoning why about that in a little bit in the Gemara. But that's not mentioned in Deuteronomy. And what we might surmise is that perhaps, and I'm saying surmise and perhaps because it's not a hard and fast law or legislation that I can point to at this point, but Deuteronomy may suggest that when we have really implemented the system and taught even angry blood avengers about the new laws, plainly understanding that lo ein mishpat mavet, him, there's no death penalty on his head, and there's a passing of the anger and an understanding that one can still remain honorable without taking the blood into his own hands and spilling it for expiation and all that's necessary. The person might be able to go free. This is what scholars debate about within the Bible studies realms about Deuteronomy 19 and why the Kohen Gadol doesn't appear. Some suggest simply there's an easier way to read it. Since it was already mentioned in Numbers, I don't need to mention it again in Deuteronomy. That's one way to think about it. But everyone from our teacher, Rabbi Doctor, Bible expert of the world, Buzzy Fishbane, Michael Fishbane, to Tzioni Zebet, the great scholar of biblical heritage and archaeology and legal systems, and particular scholarship by Ben Sommer and others about Deuteronomy suggests that the Deuteronomist has a different take many times on the priestly document. And this is where simply using them like voices of Tanaim instead of total document theory really helps and comes into play. We have two distinct voices at the very least. If you're not a person who really loves to go the notion of it's all about the biblical documents and which one is earlier and which one is later, we have two unique voices in the Torah-itic strata, like we had a Tanaitic argument within our page of Gemara. And in that Torah-itic strata, we have an absence of what we might consider to be the very central and important law of the when this guy gets out. Without saying it's the Kohen Gadol's death, we leave an opening for judges in their day to decide, which, if you remember correctly, in Parshat Shoftim, is how matters are adjudicated. The judges of your day decide right, you go right. Decide left, you go left, even though you had a different ruling generation ago. This is a Deuteronomic principle that we adjudicate matters in the courts that exist in a given generation. So this is an exciting part of Makkot, page 10. And I hope what's come to life is the notion and the kind of approach to reading Talmud that we know is inherently a part of Talmud, but is so important today in today's material that we're trying to understand Torah. And we're trying to understand Torah that has two different sections about the very same legislation. And that looks itself Talmudic in my read and scholars' read, as the Talmud makes evident in their discussion back and forth between Rav Huna and the Tanaitic material we just went through. All right, so let's process. Let's reflect. I'm at least going to take a drink and wait for somebody to really. What's the share?
I just wanted to ask, because I am trying to reconstruct why I asked the question about whether there was another way to be released from the city of refuge, because I think right before then, you were talking about doing some like rehabilitation in the city of refuge. So could you repeat what that was? Because it seemed to me, if they could never get out, why do this rehabilitation? And that suggested that there was a possibility of going out into the larger world.
That's nice. That's nice. I had not connected that piece of the narrative to this possibility that Deuteronomy leaves open and that we might sense is the way that it worked. But I really appreciate that, Bobby. Thank you. Because if the city is set up, and it's not just a penal colony, it's this place where there are academies, It's a place where there are markets. We are careful not to allow anyone to act on their anger. We, over time, educate the population. We know. We want the Chachamim on the way to say to people, refuge this way. The signs are all around, right? Street signs mean something even when I'm not thinking about, like, I have to use them to get to my destination. I see street signs as a regular, good old everyday citizen when I'm going about my business. And the idea of this exile is in society because there's signage around. So I have every piece of evidence I need within the city and outside the city to suggest that, yes, you got to be able to get out of this place, and you just need it for a certain amount of time, especially if we really do understand manslaughter is different than, the sentence for manslaughter is different than a life sentence. Like a life sentence for us equates to life sentence or the death penalty, right? So we're not talking, and couldn't possibly be talking, if I was to use exhortative language, about a life sentence if the Kohen Gadol lives longer than you. We have to see these cities as being restorative, and their atonement is possible. We even could add the theological discussion that we got into several times, because mention of atonement and mention of repatriation of sorts is apparent in the verses about what happens within the process of Torah study. So, excellent. Yeah, Barry.
I don't buy the idea that the Kohen Gadol's death essentially expiates the blood problem for a number of reasons. One is the Kohen Gadol presumably dies a natural death rather than a blood death. Number two, when the Kohen Gadol dies, I know I've asked you before how many people were in this condition, but my suspicion is that there's more than one unintentional killer in the city at the time of the death of the Kohen Gadol.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have one for one by any means.
Mm-hmm.
So you haven't expiated the blood. So that I must say, I find it fascinating, and needless to say, I'm all eager to make sure that people who killed truly unintentionally are not doomed out of existence for the rest of their life. But from a Talmudic standpoint, it's just not making it for me.
I hear you. The Gemara is going to, and the Mishnah and the Gemara are going to try to address some of the foundational principles, or the foundational principle behind why the Kohen Gadol's death really does serve to provide this release. So we're actually going to go there next, because I don't want to, leave the cliffhanger for all summer. I want to get to the next Mishnah. So we're going to look at it. We're going to at least start it together, and that will allow us some insight, I think, once we get to the piece of Gemara that we're going to end off with tonight. So hold on, and we'll address.
I have one more question. Could you just clarify what was the circumstance by which the blood redeemer, would the blood redeemer have to forgive the inadvertent, unintentional killer in order to set them free? Was there any process for that? Or is that just a kind of a imagining, or, trying to suppose how that might happen? Is there any real description of if that happened and how it might happen?
Well, we had looked at this moment where they're on the road and the sages are meant to speak to the blood avenger who comes. Their job was to say, this guy doesn't have a death penalty. That's what it kind of implied, that it was pretty straightforward about teaching them the law, and that since the court had adjudicated the matter that he was an unintentional murderer, then he really didn't have a death penalty on his head. And if you kill him, right, if you kill him, you yourself will now have a death penalty on your head. So don't kill him. That's what it seems like it said, except to say the idea a little bit, the idea of restorative justice seems to be suggested, if I want to go this direction, or at least some type of words of admitting that he did it, but says out loud, I did this unintentionally. And somehow that's supposed to be convincing. But maybe more than that, restorative justice approaches are suggested when it says that the guy himself speaks up. And that's really what there's a little part of the verse that suggested that it might just be the man himself as opposed to the two sages. And that was the whole thing about the agents versus the man himself. And if those really thinking that restorative justice could help along the system that would provide for more compassion within the fiber or the thread work of society, if they thought that this individual speaking, it seems like Rabbi Meir has that position that he might do well to say something to this guy. And it seems like he's suggesting in a certain way, because we couldn't, at least one of the ways I imagine it is, you should speak up. You should say something to this guy who's seeking your blood. But then the Gemara comes back and says, just be careful, because you could really upset him. You could really anger him more. You could really just be, he could come, and the sages could have a little bit of their power as officers of the court, as educators of society, and you could really upset the apple cart and bring death upon yourself. So I think there's a little bit of a machloket about that in each of the times we heard that. We heard that twice now, given the page 10b reading of that section as it paralleled the earlier mention of that system. And these are big questions. These are big questions within people who really take restorative justice seriously.
Thank you.
Others? Anything? Yeah, Richard?
Well, I was going to say that I don't want to hold you back from going on to the next section, but
No,
I can't see, I can only see this. I mean, I have to see this through the lens of an evolving, I mean, it's perhaps it's documentary approach here, but which one came first, Numbers, then Deuteronomy, but I can't help but see this as an evolution of thought, starting with there was this system of blood of vengeance, and then they didn't want to have that. This was something they were moving away from, and they create this. And now, as an explanation, then you're starting to get other things about expiation that's coming next, because there has to be some way of balancing out this thing that has happened, which is obviously wrong, sinful, whatever you want to call it. And so there's this evolution of thought and of explaining why one does not countenance blood avengers and the whole system of blood of vengeance. It's just a different slant being put on it as thought evolves. And I see it in that light.
Great. And that's right along with some of the scholarship that I was sharing. I was really basing myself within scholarship that looks at the priestly document, looks at the Deuteronomist, talks about it being intertextual, and the Deuteronomist kind of upending some of what we know from before. But you really do have to grapple with the question, what do you do with the silence about the law? It doesn't say he could get out earlier. It doesn't say they allow him to bring a sacrifice and expiate any guilt, because the guy's probably living with a little guilt himself. I might expect something. So if I don't go the direction of really pushing my evolution I can rely still on the Gemara's Breita, which I think you noticed, which is Ein lo mishpat mavet, lo ein mishpat mavet. The lo is the unintentional murder. So read that way, the guy who did the killing, which was unintentional, has no death penalty. That's evolution, and thusly there no one can touch him. So that's the evolution. I think comes out of the strong read of the Breita that way. Just vis-a-vis what's possible within this city. Remember the next section, which we're not going to read very particularly inside. I just want to point out before we get to the next Mishnah, it says, listen, if this city is full of manslayers or manslaughterers, and there's not the requisite elders, and they just boil it down to elders, which is a significant symbol for sages who can be good teachers and help people learn Torah and bring them back to normal life in the marketplace, because the elders also can run a city in its kind of very, very administrative way, according to the Gemara. If there's not elders in the city, you can't call it a refuge city. It's not a refuge city if it's really not set up like a true refuge city we just described in the Talmud. And it goes through and it proves it not only with verses from Numbers and Deuteronomy, but it goes through and proves it with some verses from Joshua, because it says, and he shall speak in the ears of the elder of the city about cities of refuge, meaning you've got to have someone to talk to. I once talked with Sam Klagsburn about how this was like the beginning of talk therapy. Manslaughters who lived with guilt and needed to have some kind of therapy within their provisions of what they would take, what it would take to get them out, if it got them out. That therapy and talking to elders, people with chokhmah, because what's an elder? What's a zaken in the Talmud? According to Masechet Kedushin, an elder is zeh shekana chokhmah, this one that acquired wisdom and is able to impart wisdom within a chevruta over Torah and over matters of life. And that's very important for the Gemara, that it's both over Torah matters and matters of life. Okay, so that's the section there. And then it talks a little bit about how they're supposed to speak and what tones, and that's why I had more of a discussion with Sam regarding, what kind of language, what kind of verbiage do you use? What's a way you really speak to prisoners sometimes? Is it only soft tones of dibur? Is it, kind of challenging them to talk about their crimes? I actually had an interesting discussion. I was at a luncheon with Amy. Amy was on a panel to present at the Pastoral Care Center of the Jewish Theological Seminary, along with 3 other chaplains. She was sharing about hospice chaplaincy, and Rabbi Seed, this wonderful young man who's the chaplain of Rikers Island, was sharing with me all about how he speaks with prisoners and how different prisoners really need a different level of interaction, kind of Torah as thunder and thunderously changing one's life, and some need a listening ear entirely and a way to be able to share their histories and what they feel got them to this moment. And that as a chaplain, you have to be ready to hear what folks need and not always even share language back. And there's a notion that the continuation of the Torah of Moses by way of Joshua's writing it down and really being part of what Joshua writes in, that is brought up as a very famous little piece that I just want to show you inside, because we can't really learn Makkot without just seeing this. There's a debate whether or not the last verses of Torah are written by Moses or they're written by Joshua. And it says, "Vayichtov Yehoshua et ha'devarim ha'ele v'sefer Torat Elohim. They were just saying that Joshua wrote in the verses regarding cities of refuge into his Torah, into his own teaching. But then the Gemara says, Joshua wrote these matters in the scroll of the Torah of God. Plige ba Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah have a disagreement. Chad omer shmona psukim v'chad omer are miklat. One says the references to the final 8 verses of the Torah that record the death of Moses, that Moses himself didn't write those verses, that Joshua wrote in those 8 verses. So even people who are totally traditional and say every word and every letter of Torah was given by God to Moses from Sinai, here is a small section of the Talmud that really argues vis-a-vis a Talmudic machloket as to whether or not Moses really wrote the whole Torah. And Joshua is said to have written the last verses of Torah that record Moses' death. God, in compassion, kept that from Moses and didn't want Moses to have to write about his own death. And another area of Talmudic literature parallels this one. This also is here, right in Makkot. This appears in 2 places in Talmudic literature. B'shlam alaman damar shmona psukim hainu dichtim b'sefer Torah Elohim. Eila laman damar are miklat mai b'sefer Torah Elohim. The Gemara discusses the 2 opinions granted according to the one who says that the references to the final 8 verses in the Torah, that is the reason that it is written, and Joshua wrote these matters in the scroll of the Torah of God. That makes sense. It's Torah. But what do you do in terms of saying the cities of refuge in the book of Joshua are in the scroll of the Torah of God? Well, they appear in the book of Joshua, not in the Torah. The Gemara answers, this is what the verse is saying. Hachi ka'amar vayichtov Yoshua b'sifro et hadvarim ha'ele haketuvim b'sefer Torah Elohim. So Joshua just simply wrote what was in the Torah into his book itself. So the other piece that happens here is they talk about the Torah scrolls and tefillin, and they talk about things that are dear to us by way of ritual, that we remember the very essence of why we have Torah at all and when we got it going out of Egypt, and that this is sacred law from Sinai, and that we sew it together in a certain way, and that we wear it right on our heart, right on our hands next to our hearts and on our heads, so that it really creates some, thinking kepis, thinking cups, and we ultimately get into that before we get on to the next Mishnah about the Kohen Hagadol. One other text that's parallel argues that no, it was Moses who wrote those last verses about his own death even. He was crying tears of basically Torah ink and using the tears as ink to write the last verses that recorded his own death. So just an interesting way to say that we're really back to that Torah-itic law that, again, we wanted to connect to Rabbi and Dr. Devorah Steinmetz's introduction to Jewish criminal law and jurisprudence in that book she wrote about a scholarly book about Jewish criminal law, to say, remember, it's all linked to Sinai. Remember, it's all deeply Torah, a mandate of Torah, that you're going to try to find the most justicious way to move this society forward, even when it comes to shedding blood and human beings killing human beings. The Mishnah. Echad mashuach b'shemen hamishcha, ve'echad hamirube b'vegadim, ve'echad she'avar m'mishichuto machzirin et harotzeach. The Torah states that the unintentional murder is required to wait until the death of the high priest. So the Mishnah elaborates. With regard to high priests who were appointed in several different manners, and if you recall, when we studied in Sanhedrin, we talked about very, very many different Kohens, Kohen Gadol, Kohen who went out to war, Kohen who served on court. So you had different kinds of Kohanim, so don't get thrown off. With regard to high priests, there were several different kinds of high priests. One could be anointed with anointing oil, which was the method through which the high priests were consecrated until the oil was sequestered toward the end of the first temple. One was consecrated by donning just the multiple garments, the 8 vestments, which were for the ritual. One who received a temporary appointment due to the unfitness of the serving high priest, who departed from his anointment with the restoration of the serving of the high priest. Remember, you had like a second anointed guy who wasn't necessarily the high priest, but he was on deck in case the other guy was not able to serve. So any of these, their deaths facilitate the return of a murderer from the city of refuge to his home. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af mashuach milchama machzir et harotzeach. Even the priest who's anointed for war to address soldiers facilitates the return of the murderer. So in and of itself, the Mishnah expands on the notion of the high priest. The Mishnah itself in the Tannaitic layer says that if I've got a Cohen that's out in front, I've got a 5-star general Cohen chaplain of my military, and that Cohen chaplain dies, then my city of exile people are released. Lefichach, imotehen shel kohanim misapkot lehen michya uchasut kedei shelo yipalalu al bneihem sheyamutu. We said this before too. We skipped here for a second when we had mentioned, what about the notion that people are just going to want the death of the Kohen Gadol, and they're going to plot against him, and they're going to pray for his death? It says the mothers of the high priests, and here's a good job for mothers, right? The mothers of the high priests would provide those in exiled cities sustenance and garments so that they would not pray that their sons would die. Can you see this? Like, this is like the Chabad house. The mother sets up like a whole, soup kitchen and sends them food and sends them nice garments to wear for Shabbos and Yantiv. And there's like this great sense that the mother of the Kohen Gadol is taking care of you. But by the way, think about this. If the Kohen Gadol is the teacher, if the Kohen Gadol is the one who can help make expiation real, if the Kohen Gadol is in partnership with the sages who can teach you Torah, and you can do that for a while, and all of them are able to educate society like Deuteronomy says, could really look like a place that is rehabilitative, could look like a rehab kind of house as opposed to a carceration city. The Gemara starts. Minai Hanimili. Where do we learn about these matters? Amar Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says the following: the Amar Krav Ayashav Ba'ad Moda Kohen Hagadol. We have the verse in Numbers that says he has to wait until the death of the Kohen Hagadol, the great Kohen, the high priest. The Uchativ Kiveir Miklato Yeshiv Ad Moda Kohen Hagadol. And we have a second mention, and that is he should dwell until the death of the high priest. Uchativ Acharei Moda Kohen Hagadol. It says it 3 times. 3 mentions of the death of the high priest correspond to the 3 types of high priests that were enumerated by the first Tana. So they say if it's mentioned 3 times, I can expand on who we're really talking about. Rabbi Yehuda Kativ Karav Acharina Lashuv L'Shevet Ba'aretz Ad Moda Kohen. It says, return and dwell in the land until the death of the priest. Va'idach Midalo Kativ Hagadol Chad Mahanachu. Here, since it didn't say the Kohen Gadol, but it just said the Kohen dies, and then you go back to the land, I could learn another one. L'fichach emutein shel kohanim. It says the mothers of high priests would provide those exiled to cities of refuge with garments and food. Hai matzalu maiti. Tama de lo matzalu. So the reason that the high priest will not die is that they do not pray. Hai mitzalu maiti. But if they prayed for the death of the high priest, would they really die? Does the prayer for the death of the high priest really affect his death? V'hachativ katzipor lanud kijror lauf kain klilat chinam lo tavo. Isn't it written, as the wandering sparrow, as the flying swallow, so accursed that is baseless shall come? In other words, curses we take seriously. Prayers about death of someone you should take really seriously. This verse is sometimes quoted if people say like, oh, I hope so-and-so will just die. Well, God forbid, God forbid. Katsi por lanud kajrur la'uv kain klil lachinam lo tavo. You should make sure that you're not wishing anybody such a curse. Amar le hahu sava, a certain elder said to him, I heard in this lecture, Maprike de Rava Shemili, Rava said it's not a baseless curse. Shehaya lahen levakesh rachamim al doran velo bikshu. And here Barry answers the question, what is the fundamental reason why the death of a high priest really releases everybody? Because Rava taught they should have pleaded for mercy for their generation, that no murder should transpire. You know this, I think you even included some reflection on this in your article in Orot, Barry, if I'm remembering correctly, or at least we discussed it. And they should have pleaded for mercy for their generation, that no murder should transpire, even unintentionally, and they did not pray. And due to their taking the blame or being blamed by not praying on behalf of all of those unintentional murderers, the death of the high priest really releases them. And that's where we're reading till today. And that kind of gets into this, answering this question as to why the high priest would be the one. Now, I take that in a number of different directions. One, the rabbis are saying that, and this is a little bit of, you could see this as a negative thing, even though sometimes we get very positive notions of who the high priests were and what their powers were. Remember, there's an argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's an argument between the sages and the Kohanim of sorts, and they are saying they really didn't take their responsibility deeply enough, and they didn't pray that we should have a world where no unintentional murder exists, let alone killing of any type. Two, the Kohen Gadol had a responsibility, according to Tanakh, to make the groups of Kohanim that existed around Eretz Yisrael. Remember, there are 24 watches. There are 24 different groups. They live not in the temple. Can't think of Kohens living in the temple. They are our education force. They are out there supposedly educating the population, not b'diavad. We want them not to do an after-the-fact kind of education. We want the Kohanim to be proactive in their being educators. And we need to figure out a way that an educational system of Torah values and Torah laws really gets into the fiber and into the framework of society. And they didn't take that responsibility deeply enough, because the Chachamim were the ones to be sent out on the roads. The Chachamim were the sages who really needed to educate. Blood vengeance still was remaining within the hearts and minds of these people who should have been educated. And since the Kohen Gadol is the symbolic head, he's the one who ultimately is symbolically the release valve. Now, the Tanaim made it so that it's more than just the Kohen Gadol, as we saw. They expanded on the list of who the Kohanim were, who could die off, and then you could say that there's a release. I'm sure that we could argue about whether or not it, got in there one day, and if the guy died in battle, was it enough time? I imagine that there were different machlokas. We don't have texts that basically come to make what my teacher, Rabbi Benzi Bergman, called klutz kasha. We're not looking to be klutzy. We're not looking to make a kashi on the klutzy stuff. Like, oh, well, if he was only there 3 days and the guy happened to, die according to all sources, but then they revived him with the ancient version of CPR, would you say that the exile is still in effect, or does he have to go back to the city of refuge? Like Mela, that's a fun Purim Torah, but that's like not the klutz kashi that we're into. So this is a powerful assertion by the Talmud. It's the assertion by the Talmud, in essence. And So let's talk it out. What do you make of it? And do we pin such high hopes on the Cohen as a symbolic teacher and educator for community that really failed us? And is it a commentary even more so on a system of religious worship that failed us, and the rabbi's notion of prayer, and however it's going to really become a culture of Talmud Torah is on the table as well, as we know from the fact that the cities of refuge are places where Zakanim, teachers, Torah academies, and talking Torah really replaces the kind of culture of expiation through sacrifice. All right, folks, what do you think?
I maybe go back to my original theory and see how it plays out against this deeper meaning that I've now acquired through your excellent teaching. So my interpretation was that this is just recapitulating what happens to Moses, because the Torah is pretty explicit that immediately after the Pharaoh's death, that's when Moses gets called. And when Moses objects, what God says a little later on is that you can go back because all the people who wanted to kill you are now gone. Because he knows what's in Moses's mind, obviously, and why Moses is hesitating to take on this responsibility. And so if that's really the case, that we're just recapitulating those relationships, then you could make the following kinds of parallels. That the death of the Kohen Gadol is really just a yardstick for when the anger of the redeemers or self-proclaimed redeemers abates. The one thing we know for sure is that time is the greatest healer, and even the greatest passion and the most determined, early feeling for revenge often dissipates. And so I've always taken this really as more of a yardstick, because that's when God says the people who wanted to kill you are dead, or it's not a problem. So here I think it's really fun Talmud, frankly, to hear the ways in which they're trying to get many additional thoughts. Obviously, I think the relationship between the people writing the Gemara and how they really feel about the high priest is also coming out here. And the fact that there's been this expansion of high priesthood, it's hard for me not to think that there's a little anxiety here about what's actually happened to this otherwise pristine office that really was singular. I mean, if there was anything singular in all of Jewish worship, there are plenty of Levites and there are plenty of all of the rest, but the pyramid was supposed to get to the top here, and all of a sudden we're finding this is a pyramid with multiple peaks. So that comes as a great shock to me, frankly, and I'm still trying to process it. So I don't know how that fits in, but those are my comments. But I'm thrilled at the attempt to resolve what is a really fundamental issue of blood expiation, which is the thing we heard in Genesis.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for bringing in all those various texts and the Moses story as the narrative, the nomos, and the nature of how law played out potentially in those narrative scenes, and then the workout with the codes as they exist and the relationships that came into focus. Barry, thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I again see this as somewhat tendacious in terms of justifying what they want to have happen and looking for an explanation that they could put up. I think it was to me, it seems it was very clear that they had already decided, you had already said that the manslaughter, the unintentional killer, was not guilty of any crime. So you have them now in a city originally to protect them. But now how do you release them? What's the mechanism? And so there is this verse, I don't know where they may have said it came from about the death of the high priest, but they immediately, I think this is Barry's question, is where all these people came from. I think they suddenly identified, to me it seems, they identified a whole bunch of people who could fill that role under the definition of high priest, so that basically it was not infrequent that one of these people were old enough to have passed away or have had an accident or something, so that the release would be frequent, relatively frequent, not once in a generation, but multiple times, that the people who were exiled would have an opportunity to be freed. Because I think the intention was they were only in the city of exile to protect them, but there was to protect them from a system of justice that they wanted to force into obsolescence. And so they needed this bridge to get there. And to me, it seemed like it's an historical evolution of thinking about the death penalty and courts and systems of justice, that they were rooting in what they could find in the Torah and the Mishnah and so on to really justify what they had intended to do.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I would say evolution is important to notice whenever it's happening, right? So that it gives you a hope about a history pointing in a certain direction, right? Right, Barry? Yeah, Meira.
To follow up on what Richard just said, because I had similar thought. I'm sorry, my voice is not right, but I'll try to speak anyway. To follow up on the same kind of thought that it's a release mechanism. To me, I cannot help it, but I see a conceptual parallel with the idea of the Jubilee, when slaves are released from bondage. There's some higher principle here, and as Richard said, it's a mechanism. And because those priests may die at any time, it's not regulated by a period, but more by like who's dying now. But it's the idea that it's a penalty that has to end at some point. They did not have a prison system, just you're punished or you're not punished. So that Miklat is kind of a prison. And it's only a question of when can you be released or pardoned from that and join society again. I'm sorry for my voice, something is wrong with that, but it's the Jubilee, and maybe I'm missing some other mechanism or process in the Torah that's similar to that.
Nice. So no, your voice sounded fine. I'm sorry for your
To me, I'm
you're straining.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that there was a release and a mechanism for it is already in Numbers. Jubilee, of course, was already in Vayikra. We do have a sense that people need to be released from certain statuses and certain kinds of sentences, and this was how it did work out. The question really was, could I expand that? Did the sages in their evolution, as you did mention, all of you, could they expand that? And so they did, it seems. And so they did want to find more releases, and they did want to find ways to release. The only thing that argues against that is the very end of this section before the next Mishnah, which I'm just going to summarize for you, because it just stands as a little bit of a conservative opinion. And that is, it says, well, maybe what they were talking about is a time when there wasn't actually a high priest in office. Like, he died, they hadn't really found one yet. And then people wanted to know, well, what are you going to do with all the people in the city of exile? Until you find that other one, we've got to know who we're putting it as the release mechanism. And then it's one or another, and it's not all of them at once. The expansive view that it's all of them at once really gives me a different sense that we're looking to talk about length of sentences here and be able to debate, is this guy on good behavior? Can we put him on parole now, if you will? Can we expect that he's going to be a productive part of society and repatriated with his family and to his land where we can send him back to, because it really wasn't unintentional. So all of this comes into focus in a way that that allows us to say, is it total evolution and expansion, or is it evolution and a careful implementation of a system of release? Either way, it's an evolution. I do see that, and it's connected to this notion of the priesthood, though, that serves to fulfill a very ancient sense that we still might be holding on to, that someone's death has to atone. And remember, death makes for atonement in our tradition, and we have to figure out what that means sometimes. And that's a piece of the mystery of life and death itself. Folks, this has been an amazing year of Gemara learning together through the Zoom Beit Midrash. We're continuing along with this great material of Makkot next year, and I just think it's great Gemara. And I so appreciate all your insights and questions and your being ready on Wednesdays and the schedule as it goes. We're Jews, we have Yontifs. Person has a tzedakah banquet. This one has a travel plan. That one has, but you're really able to come back to the narrative and be here. And I so appreciate that intentionality and kavanah and the great chevruta that happens within our group. So yishar kochachem, and
We all thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Welcome, everybody.
Yes, thank